After the Revolutionary War, Americans had this huge task ahead of them, building a whole new nation. I mean, they just rejected a king, but what were they going to replace him with? This whole period was a real clash between these amazing revolutionary ideals and the tough, messy reality of actually governing. So, let's dive right in. In this explainer, we're really going to tackle the two big questions of this era. First, why did America's first shot at a national government, the Articles of Confederation, just completely fall apart? And second, what were the major and, often really controversial compromises they had to make to even create the U.S. Constitution in the first place?
We're going to break this down into four main parts. We'll start with the big idea that drove the founders, this concept of a republic. Then, we'll see who was actually included in this new vision and who was left out. After that, we'll look at the first government's failure. And finally, we'll get into how the Constitution was hammered out through a ton of debate and compromise.
Okay, so first up, the ideal. After living under a king, what kind of government did the revolutionaries actually want? Well, the answer was a republic. But what did that word republic really mean to them back then?
So the revolutionaries had one really clear goal: no more kings. Monarchy, with its power passed down through family and its subjects to serving a crown, that was totally out. Instead, they looked way back into the past for ideas, especially to the ancient Roman Republic. They pictured a state without any king, where the citizens themselves would choose their own leaders to represent their interests. And to answer a key review question directly, what form of government did they choose? American revolutionaries turned to republicanism, which is a state where citizens choose their leaders. In a world that was full of kings, this was a pretty radical idea.
But here's a super important distinction. Their idea of a republic was not what we think of as democracy today. It was all built on this idea of civic virtue, the belief that leaders should be selfless, putting the public good way ahead of their own personal gain. And they believed that property owners were the ones who had this virtue, the ones most qualified to govern. They were actually scared that giving power to everybody else would just lead to chaos, or what they called mob rule.
So the main thing to remember for this section is this. The new ideal of republicanism was not about equality for everyone. It really favored an elite class of property owners who were seen as the most virtuous and therefore the most qualified to lead the new nation. All right, so that was the ideal. Now let's get into the reality. The revolution's big talk about equality crashed right into the country's existing social structure, especially when it came to women, enslaved people, and Native Americans. For married women, the revolution brought almost zero change to their legal standing. Under a legal doctrine called coverture, a married woman had no independent legal or economic identity. What that means is she couldn't own property, she couldn't run a business, she couldn't have any economic life separate from her husband. He literally controlled everything. Now, some women, like the amazing Abigail Adams, pushed back. In 1776, she wrote this famous letter to her husband John while he was off helping create the new government. She urged him to remember the ladies. But his response? He basically laughed it off. It just shows you how deeply ingrained these masculine systems really were.
Okay, quick recall moment. What was that legal status that made married women totally dependent on their husbands? The answer is coverture. It's a really important term for understanding the role of women back then.
The contradiction of slavery was even more obvious, and this slide really gets at the paradox of Thomas Jefferson. Here's a guy who wrote, "All men are created equal," yet he enslaved over 100 people himself. In his own writings, he called slavery a moral evil, but at the same time, he argued that black people were inferior and should eventually be removed from the United States. But the revolutionary ideals did lead to some pretty radical changes. One of the biggest happened in Virginia. Before the war, the Church of England was the official church supported by taxes. But in 1786, Virginia passed its Statute for Religious Freedom. This ended the state church and established real religious liberty. It was a huge moment for the separation of church and state. So, to wrap this section up, the key point to remember is that the revolutionary ideals of equality fell way short in reality. For women, for enslaved people, and for Native Americans, the new nation was really a white republic that denied them the very freedoms it promised. Okay, so you have these states founded on some pretty conflicted ideals. How do they try to govern themselves as one country? Their first shot was something called the Articles of Confederation, and, to put it mildly, it was a failure. This slide really shows you how incredibly weak this first government was designed to be. The National Congress had no power to tax, so it couldn't pay off its war debts. There was no president to lead the country, no national court system at all. To get any major law passed, 9 out of 13 states had to agree, and to change the articles, you needed all 13. It was made to be weak because people were afraid of a strong central government, but it ended up being too weak to even function. Now, despite all its weaknesses, the Confederation Congress did have one big success. So, what power did it actually have? Well, the answer is it had the power to create land ordinances. It set up a system for settling the Western lands and bringing new states into the Union, and that blueprint actually shaped how America expanded for years to come.
But that one success couldn't fix the country's huge economic problems. And this brings us to a major cause and effect situation. The cause? Farmers, a lot of them veterans from the war, were facing crazy high taxes and crushing debt, and the paper money they had was worthless. The effect? In 1786, they rose up in an armed rebellion in Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion, shutting down courthouses to stop their farms from being taken.
Shays' Rebellion absolutely terrified the nation's leaders. It was the ultimate proof that the government just wasn't working. So remember this takeaway. The weak Articles of Confederation couldn't solve the country's economic crisis, and that led to a rebellion that convinced a lot of people that a much stronger government was needed, fast.
And that leads us right into our final section, the compromise. The chaos from Shays' Rebellion was really the final straw. So, in 1787, delegates from 12 of the states met in Philadelphia with the goal of creating a whole new government.
The convention almost immediately ran into a huge problem over this one question: representation. The big states, like Virginia, supported what was called the Virginia Plan. It said representation in Congress should be based on population, which would give them way more power. The small states fired back with the New Jersey Plan, demanding equal representation for every single state. The whole thing came to a grinding halt.
So how did they solve this deadlock? The answer is the Connecticut Compromise, which you might also hear called the Great Compromise. It created the system we still have today, a two-house, or bicameral, legislature. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. That's equal representation. But in the House of Representatives, representation is based on population.
But, figuring out representation for the states created another, much darker question. How do you count the nearly 700,000 enslaved people who were legally just considered property? The answer they came up with was this fraction.
This was the 3/5 compromise, a really grim example of political deal-making. For the purpose of figuring out representation in Congress, every 5 enslaved people would be counted as 3 free persons. This gave the southern slave states a lot more political power than they would have had otherwise.
So, the key takeaway for this whole section is this: the Constitution wasn't some perfect document handed down from on high. It was born from intense, difficult, and sometimes morally awful compromises over power, representation, and slavery.
All right, let's do a quick final review of the must-know facts. First, a republic is a government where citizens select leaders. Next, the cause of Shays' Rebellion was farmer debt and high taxes. The big impact of the Articles of Confederation was that it couldn't tax, which led to an economic crisis. The Connecticut Compromise is what created our Senate and House. The 3/5 Compromise gave southern states more political power. Virginia's 1786 Statute for Religious Freedom separated church and state. Coverture meant married women had no independent legal status. And finally, the Constitution was ratified by special state conventions, not by a direct popular vote.
We'll end with a final question for you to think about. The founders were really suspicious of direct democracy. They intentionally created a republic with a lot of filters, like the Electoral College and, at the time, an appointed Senate to limit the power of the popular majority. So how does that original choice, that deep-seated fear of mob rule, still shape American politics and our debates about government today?